Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Insight Speaker Series. As you know, we host these events to help you as CPAs understand the trends that are shaping the economy and the world. I'm Carol Wilding, President and CEO of CPA Ontario. Now, to truly appreciate the topic of today's discussion, we need to look back to January 1, 1994, when the North America Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, came into force. The agreement became the symbol of a new era of globalization and the deepening of our relationship between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. NAFTA was a historic moment, but it was not without controversy. Supporters made the case for the economic benefits of a common North American market, including lower consumer prices, integrated supply chains, and an improved standard of living. Its critics argued that it would hollow out manufacturing and weaken national sovereignty. One of those critics now sits in the Oval Office, and he has set his sights on reshaping America's economic relationship with the world, including Canada. The arguments that animated the debates surrounding NAFTA were echoed in President Trump's first term during the negotiation of the Canada-U.S. Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA as we call it. Some questioned whether the new agreement would limit Canada's ability to set its own economic policy. And as one of our panelists today, Professor Barry Appleton, said, and I quote, "CUSMA's Chapter 19 leaves little capacity for Canada to engage in proper data regulation and therefore protect its citizens," end quote. At the same time, CUSMA has supported the continued integration of North America's supply chains, giving Canadian businesses relatively free access to the largest market on Earth. These are the trade-offs that Canada will have to grapple with when on July 1st, the first mandatory joint review of CUSMA will begin. All three parties will have to confirm their wish to extend the agreement, enter into a period of annual reviews, or at any point trigger a path towards a unilateral withdrawal. But no matter which scenario plays out, the implications for our economy and our country are profound. As CPAs supporting Ontario and Canadian businesses, you understand that impact all too well. The thoughtful, pre-submitted questions that we received are proof of that. You asked about what kind of leverage Canada has in these negotiations. You asked if Canada will still have a viable auto industry. And you asked about the possibility of diversifying our trade relationships. But by far, the most popular question is the question that has been on the minds of many Canadians over the past 18 months, which is, what is the future of our relationship with the superpower to the south? What are the trade-offs that Canada should be willing to accept in that relationship? And what do those trade-offs mean for our economy, our politics, and our sovereignty? So whether the July 1 review is a turning point or a tipping point is the focus of our conversation today. And we are very fortunate to be joined by two experts with decades of experience in international trade and relations. Professor Barry Appleton is the managing partner at Appleton & Associates International Lawyers, LP. He's the co-director of the International Law Center at New York Law School and a scholar and fellow at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Professor Appleton is the author of numerous publications on economic law, including 2 books about NAFTA. Joining Professor Appleton is the Honourable Bob Rae. He brings over 5 decades of leadership at the highest levels of international diplomacy, national politics, and public policy. Most recently, Bob Rae served as the ambassador and permanent representative of Canada to the United Nations in New York. Prior to his diplomatic service, he was elected to federal and provincial parliaments 11 times between 1978 and 2013. The author of 5 books, Bob Rae is a Privy Councillor, a Companion of the Order of Canada, and a member of the Order of Ontario. Now, to lead today's discussion, I'm very happy to welcome back to the Insight stage Vassy Kapelos, Chief Political Correspondent for CTV News. Vassy, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Carol. Thanks, everybody. Very happy to be with you today. I'm very happy to be with both of you, Bob and Barry. It's a real pleasure. I've never gotten to interview Barry, but I have had the pleasure many times of interviewing Bob, so I'm looking forward to this discussion. I know I'm going to learn something and our audience will as well. And I wanted to start off before we start looking to the future, assessing, essentially the potential, the different scenarios that can play out, to get your assessment on what it is right now, like what we face at this moment. And if you could, Bob, in one sentence, describe the relationship as you see it at this point in time between Canada and the United States, how would you?
I'd say it's testy. I think there's a lot of things on the table, a lot of things at stake in the discussion. And I think that we have to be objective enough to say there are things that the Americans are concerned about, and there are things that we're concerned about in terms of the behavior of both countries and where things seem to be going. But underneath it, what we're looking at is an economic relationship that's about trade happens between businesses. It doesn't happen between countries alone. It happens because businesses want to do business with each other. And I think the underlying positive thought that we should have is that businesses on both sides of the border want a deal. They want a steady relationship that's going to allow them to continue to do business together. And I think that's the thing that we should bear in mind as we try to navigate some of the things that are underway. It's not just about politics. It's also about business. It's also about defense. It's about geopolitics in an important way. So all those things complicate matters, but they also make it more interesting as we go forward.
Interesting is definitely one way to put it. Barry, if I could ask you to zero in on how you would characterize the economic aspect of the relationship as it relates to trade at this moment in time, how would you describe it succinctly?
So Vash, my sense about it is a little bit different from Bob Rae's. And Bob Rae has forgotten more than everybody in the government knows today because of his extensive experience. So I don't want to minimize it, but I think there's been a profound change in how we look at these things. And so my sense is that we think that we're going to have sort of a review and a discussion that's like a PowerPoint checkup, it's like a health checkup. And the Americans are looking at this like a corporate takeover. And it's a very different type of negotiations, deeply transactional, deeply focused. It's in a way that's so different from what we've always done. We've always worked together to make a bigger pot, a bigger way. And I think we have to change that thinking. So before, we would think a lot about market access. And I got my start actually working in the government that Premier Rae was on. I was able to advise the Cabinet, North American Cabinet Committee on NAFTA, basically. And that's where I learned where this was. And at that time it was about building, having certainty, having access, knowing what we could do. Today, it's not about access. Today, it's about certainty. And we have a lack of certainty. And so our problem is that we have a U.S. government that isn't focused on the economic betterment. That's not the objective. It's other objectives, and that is different. It's a different game plan. We've got to play it differently. That makes all of this different, and that's why we have so much uncertainty. It's trying to cope with that.
So from a kind of top-down view then, Bob, I think that one thing that has stuck following the Prime Minister's speech in Davos that a lot of Canadians are trying to kind of figure out, do you align with that? Is it going to actually materialize in this way? Is this idea that it's a permanent rupture? That what Barry just described has led to a fundamental shift in the way our two economies will interact and the two countries will interact that will not change. Like there is something that will forever be different. And there's a political debate over whether in fact that's the case. Do you think it is?
Well, I certainly think it's true of the current administration. I mean, I don't disagree with what Barry said to say this time it's different. Of course it's different. But what I was trying to point out was that there are other elements that mean that there's things of continuity that are still there and we should never lose sight of. And there's no telling what the political forces will be within the United States over the next period of time that will get the administration to see things differently. If you took a snapshot in time and said, what are we dealing with now? Well, we're dealing with a government in the United States that is, I wouldn't describe it as unpredictable. I would say it's pretty predictable. We know that they're out for number one, and we know that they view life as a series of transactions. And everyone here has been involved in business. Everyone listening will know there's a difference between a transaction and a relationship. If you have a relationship, you're thinking about what is the next transaction going to be like? How do I create trust? How do I create confidence? That's the normal way in which we conduct our lives, is trying to create spaces of predictability and spaces of certainty. I think that's very true. I think the challenge we have right now is we're dealing with a very different administration. And I think what the Prime Minister was trying to do in the Davos speech was say, wake up, folks, this is different. We're in a different moment. We're not in a moment when we can talk about benignly the rule of law, all the things that we did together before, all the things that we thought were important. That's not the world we're in right now. And that's what has led our current government to say, we have to walk this line between wanting to get the best deal we can in the context of a commercial relationship that we have with the United States, recognizing that it's different than it ever has been politically in that relationship. And then look at more broadly speaking, what's our big strategy in terms of where we need to go? And that's one where we need to diversify and we need to be able to move around. Now, the problem we have is, what if our number one partner says, actually, we don't want you to diversify?
As they are.
And that's what they're saying to us.
Yes, they
I mean, they are saying to it in a variety of ways. We don't really want you to be going out and being nice to China or having a relationship with India. We'll take care of that stuff. So that's what makes this 51st states thing real. For this is the first time we've dealt with a government in the United States that did not respect and does not respect our sovereignty and does not respect our independence, and basically is looking for what Barry's talked about, is much more of a takeover than it is how do we build a relationship going forward. And that's what makes the outcome of this discussion so uncertain, because I can see a scenario where it would go one way, and I can see a scenario where it could go very much a different way. And I think what the Prime Minister is trying to do is say to us, we'd better be alert to all of these risks and challenges that we have, because they're very real. And we shouldn't underestimate the size of those challenges. This is a different ball game from the one we've played before. We're in a different game.
Your point, Barry, about the administration not orienting itself around economic betterment, I think is really salient and helps kind of when you're trying to comprehend why they're doing what they're doing, maybe helps us a little bit. Because I think at the outset, a lot of economists were saying, look, this tariff regime is so punitive to consumers that alone is eventually going to push him off it, right? And that will ultimately result in some sort of leverage for the countries that are trying to attempt to get them taken off or trying to negotiate a bigger deal. It seems like, first of all, business has absorbed a lot more than we maybe anticipated at the outset. But I don't know necessarily if that will materialize. Like, it doesn't, the big businesses, like the big automakers, they're upset about the tariffs, but they're still standing next to the president in the Oval Office, extolling the virtues of the idea that he's going to move more manufacturing back there. Like, what are the implications of that for how we should understand what the U.S. wants out of all this?
All right, so let's unpack that, because there's a lot in there, and it's really important that we try to understand it. The first thing is, and where I have a little bit of a disagreement with the approach from the Prime Minister, who's trying to do the best he can, but at the end of the day, we're very focused on what our traditional rule has been, which is that we're focused on the rule of law, something I've spent my life dealing with, who's right and who's wrong. It's sort of like marital therapy. And that's not what this is about. And for those CPAs that know when we do transactions, sometimes we have to sort of be quiet about what our personal views are about the deal and get the deal done. So the Mexicans, who have very, very specific views, and they're not very happy, and we thought they were going to be the number one country of the three CUSMA countries that would come out and say, President Trump, we disagree, we're going to maintain our sovereignty, we're going to focus on this. They've been really quiet. They want to know, what does the administration want and how do we get there?
They're in meetings as we speak now with Mr. Greer.
They are there. So let's go unpack it. I did a paper with the Brookings Institution, a Washington think tank. It's about to come out, where we've actually modeled all of the elements of the CUSMA review. From a U.S. perspective, not one of them is economically additive, accretive to the U.S. economy. Wow. So we know that this is not a policy about making better economic choices for the United States. And certainly we know it's not a better policy in terms of the tariffs and the impact on affordability. We know that already too. So it's about economic statecraft. It's about something at power deployment and other types of things. Exactly what Bob Rae just talked about control of a variety of things. And we know that there's a list of some of the things that they want. Well, I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about those. But at the same time, it's really about they want to win and they want to show a big deal, a good deal, a better deal. That's their MO. It's not economically in their interest. Economically, it's in their interest to do a huge defense and economic relationship with us, because that's how we're wired. That's what we want to do, and we've done it so well. But all of these things are net negative. So we need to think about how we plan for that, how we focus on that. And so one of the questions is, I loved the speech that took place at Davos, but I would have suggested that we not make it. Why? Because the better part of valor is discretion. You I'm sure know or knew John Holmes.
Very well.
Right, so did I. He was my mentor.
Right, me too.
And so I know, that's why I'm saying that we know sometimes what we want to say can't be what we actually say, even though we wanted to. So I was ready to cheer, but I thought it made the Americans angry, and the China issue made them angry, and they keep blaming it. And what I worry about is blaming and shaming Canada. So first, they're focusing on Mexico this week and next week. I think that's going to happen relatively quickly because Mexico is even more dependent on them than we are. And then they're going to use that to set the table for Canada. So I'm very fearful about that. I have ideas about what we can do, but that's their approach, because they designed the CUSMA. If you look at Jared Kushner, he was the architect of the CUSMA. And Jared said, we did it like a real estate deal. We wanted to lease up the building first, and then we would do a review at 6 years. And the stronger economic party could exert economic leverage on the weaker. And I assume the U.S. would always be stronger. That's what this CUSMA review is about. It's the only agreement in the world that has a review. None of the other ones have it. And I'll tell you, after they see this, no one will ever agree to do it again, because it's about extraction of value from Canada and Mexico. And that's not a good place to start.
So I'll just jump off that, because I could see you itching to kind of jump in on the point around, like, how far do we go in pushing the bear? And I think it's a live political debate, and has been over the last year, right? And at different inflection points, you've seen actually the government and opposition with elbows up, medium up, and kind of down, right? And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to figure out, okay, at what point are we where with our elbows? What is your view of that, Bob?
Well, I think you've taken a different road. First of all, Barry's comment about, should the Prime Minister have given the speech? I look at things very, very differently. My view is he gave the speech. So we can second guess it till the cows come home. That's not important.
He's giving another one right now.
He'll give lots of speeches, and I think
New York, I should
one of the challenges that he faces, and one of the challenges we face as a country, is that we have interests and values as the United States does, and we don't see things through the same lens that the United States does, and I also think there are many people in the United States, in fact, I would argue quite a substantial majority right now, who don't see life through the same transactional, I'm the king of the castle approach that we describe as, quote, the American approach. It's not the, quote, American approach. It's the approach of this administration, and particularly of this president. So from time to time, we have to take a step back and say, what is it we're trying to do here, and how effectively can we do it in the context in which we're having this discussion. My point that I've been trying to make, and I'll continue to make it through this discussion, is don't overlook all of the broad aspects of public opinion, both business opinion and broader public opinion, on both sides of the border and in Mexico, that will limit what each government is really able to do. Can the government get away with seeing this as a purely economic transaction entirely in their own self-interest, which is how they operate? That way of operating has serious problems attached to it for the people who think they can get away with it, because at some point you can't.
Do you think so, though, in the case of Trump?
Oh yes, Mr. Trump is.
Hasn't he proven the opposite?
No. I've actually, you and I have these discussions all the time. Everybody who's in power thinks they're going to be there forever, and everybody who's in power thinks their power is limitless. His power is not limitless. Nobody's power is limitless. And that's, I think, where we have to try to find the areas of agreement, where we can see the areas of agreement, and where we can see the possibilities going forward. But ultimately, we have to understand that the reason why I said at the beginning is this is a very difficult discussion is because we have to recognize it's possible we might not get a deal. And the worst thing you can do in negotiation, I mean, Barry knows more about this than I do, but from my experience, the worst thing you can do in negotiation is say, I'm at the table, I have to get a deal. Right away, you've declared, you've said, I've given away a lot of cards here. Because one of the cards we have, along with the Mexicans, is say, you know what, we don't want a deal. And the president may say he doesn't want a deal. And I think we need to be prepared for that possibility. I think personally there will be a deal, and I think that because I think ultimately some sane heads will prevail, but I also think it's possible that it might not happen. And I don't think you can say that's the end of the world. No, it's very difficult and it's not great, but we're dealing with an administration that in my view is very difficult and not great. So it's hard to get a deal.
So that leads me to, and I want to remind everyone watching that actually you can send in additional questions as you listen to the comments here on stage, but leads me to what I was told in advance of this, Barry, was the number one question that people watching and people who had signed up had sent in, which is what is the worst case scenario throughout these next few months in the larger trading relationship? What's the worst case scenario for us?
Okay, so I've actually modeled on an economic basis the 5 most likely outcomes. One is that there's no deal, and we go back to what we would have without a deal at all. The other is the deal continues as it is. And then 3 models, sort of the UK model of a 10% tariff across the board, a 15% tariff across the board, and a 25% tariff across the board. So, you know, at the end of the day, the Americans have made it very clear they would really want to have a tariff across the board. That would be the price of getting rid of these sectoral tariffs. Those are called Section 232 tariffs. And as you know, they're affecting our auto, our assembly, and our parts, our steel, our aluminum, and lumber is a separate area, but it's also into that. But what we haven't actually even thought about yet is what's coming. See, those are national security issues, but there's a thing called 301s. The 301s are an allegation that we've been inconsistent with our existing treaty. The 301s are what I call economic hostage taking. And what I mean by that is they say that we're in violation of the treaty. They say our HST/GST is a violation of the treaty. And they can impose tariffs on any area, anywhere in Canada, and it doesn't even have to be of equivalent effect, and it could be at any time. And they're going to find the most vulnerable sections that they can to twist and hurt us. And that's on the books. It's coming for June and July. So not only do we have our Canada Day special to start the CUSMA review, but we have the Section 301s coming. So all the pressure's going to keep ramping up. So let's answer now the question. In some respects, we might be better to go back to a WTO world with MFN tariffs. That's one option. Okay, another option is that we have a tariff of 10%, but we can get out of some of the things that limited us in the CUSMA. And the reason I say that is that when we negotiate the CUSMA, we didn't carefully think about the impact of the intangible and digital economy, which has now grown tremendously since the CUSMA came in. And so now everything's about the impact of AI, of data streams, of the impact that we're going to have from digital payments and all of those things. That is so valuable. 41 of the top 50 companies in the S&P are valued now entirely on the basis of innovation. That's all covered, and we gave away Parliament's sovereignty to deal with a tremendous amount of public policy in those areas in the trade agreement because we didn't think it was going to be that important. And so it may be that giving up some of that existing part could be worthwhile and take the 10% tariff, that's certain. It's all about dealing with certainty. None of these are good, but what I do know is this. A tariff of 15% or higher creates permanent, irreversible damage to Canada. And I would stress that if I was giving any advice around the table, that we cannot accept 15% or higher in any way that is just there's no going back.
That's a
from
red
that.
line for you.
Worse than a red line. That is an outcome that is disastrous across the board.
What is the objective, Bob, for Canada through this process? Is it to survive or something else?
Well, I think it's more than to survive. I mean, I think the desire is which is, you know, what the government says privately as well as publicly. The desire is to obviously avoid the worst possible scenarios, but it's also to say, well, where are the areas that we can cooperate? What can we think about that's going to be constructive and positive? The government hasn't announced what those are. I mean, they're not going to. It's the sort of thing you do in a negotiation to say, here's some things we think we could make some way on.
We have some hints, though, in the new Keystone, things like that.
Yes,
right?
yeah. There's lots of ways on a number of issues which the president has raised. Even looking at what are the other outside trade-offs that you make? Is there a defense component to this that needs to be part of the discussion? Now the Americans always say, no, this is just a trade negotiation, but I don't think that's entirely the case. I think there are always going to be other elements to the discussion. I think it's very hard to say our objective is certainty. We're dealing with Donald Trump. I mean, the certainty, he likes to keep you on your toes all the time. He will immediately turn away and say, oh, I thought that we did that. Oh, I didn't do it. And you'll see this. And this is what makes negotiating so difficult. I mean, when I was living in New York, it would be very difficult to find people who were in the real estate business who'd say, I really want to go back and do deals with the president again because they were so much fun and they were so pleasant. And he's such a great guy to work with. I mean, that's not the word on the street in New York City. And that's what we're dealing with. Let's be honest.
So I wanted to, before we get into some of the specifics, I did want to ask you, again, from a more macro perspective, Barry, I think the bigger existential question that we're dealing with, and Bob referenced this, and so did the Davos speech, is this idea that, the impetus to diversify has never been such. And some of the lines that the Prime Minister used to use were like, we can give ourselves what they take away. I conducted an interview a few months ago with the ambassador from Japan that really stayed with me because they requested to do the interview, so they had a message to deliver. And the message was, our trade with you, particularly, our investment in the auto sector, is dependent on the access we get to the American market. And he was explicit about it and clearly came to deliver that message knowing that I would generate a headline out of that. But it did strike me because it was a very open proclamation of the value of the trading relationship that we have, the market access that we have. Can we give ourselves what they could take away or already have to an extent?
So look, at the end of the day, we will certainly come up to some arrangement to have market access because they need us to have market access and they need access to us, okay? And so there's going to be something that's going to get negotiated. But let's first of all talk about diversification. Diversification is a great idea, but we should have been doing the diversification 15 and 20 years ago. It's like today we say we need a shade tree, but if you plant the seed today, you don't get it today. So these are fabulous policies. I applaud the Prime Minister for doing the diversification. I applaud the Prime Minister for putting the work in to get the deals. But deals don't do it alone. And diversification takes time. And so what we need is that we were able to get a very sweet spot because we were adjacent to the huge American market and we had market access. But now, what problem is we don't have certainty to the American market. So the price of certainty is not free. And what the Americans are telling us is this is like an Uber with surge pricing, or what's going to happen potentially with FIFA tickets, or what happens when Taylor Swift comes to town, okay? They want a price, and they want a surge price, and they want us to pay in advance, and then they want it again and again. And that's the difficulty, because what Bob Rae's talking about is economic rationale. It is the way that we've done things, the way we should do things. It's the way we grow the pie. It makes total sense. We're in a world that no longer follows on economic rationality. We have to be prepared for the uncertainty that goes with it. So the difficulty is that, and who am I to disagree with Bob Rae? But Bob,
Well, you're Barry Appleton.
well, that's true. By nature, I'm disagreeable. But at the end of the day, I don't believe that we're going to have reversion to that mean. I don't think we're going back to that world. I think that world has ended. And even if we were to have a change of administration, which we all remember, Trump's a one-termer, right? A change of administration, I still think they're going to do it. Remember, after Trump won, we had the Biden administration. They didn't change all those things. And so at the end of the day, my sense about American trade politics is a little more tainted because I had an office for 17 years in Washington, D.C., and I had a taste of their politics, and it's a little bit different from ours.
Can I follow up quickly and just ask you, because I think people watching who certainly have clients in these sectors are wondering, what does that mean for sectors like the auto industry? Like, are they dead?
So look, I think that the president wants to reshore permanently steel sector and auto assembly, and I think he's going to do a real pressure with a gradual reshoring of auto parts. It's going to be very difficult. I get calls all the time for people on the auto parts. We try to be as compliant to get them out of the punitive tariffs. They're going to put more and more pressure on it. It's terrible for Ontario. It's terrible for Canada. It's wrong across the board, but that's where I think we are. The aluminum decision, for example, makes no sense. They don't even have aluminum, and yet they would put these punitive, do these things. So there are things that will work their way out, let's say. But steel, he seems to have he's like a dog with a bone. He wants to bring back steel. It's just part of the Trump personal view. It makes no sense on a macroeconomic basis, but that's his view. So our problem is, for those sectors, we're going to have a problem, and we have more sectors to come. See, actually, our problem is this game isn't over. We've gone through a year and a half of absolute hell with those sectoral tariffs. More are coming. So we need to figure out what can we do to try to deal with it. And good public policy is about trying to figure out the safe spot in the storm, right? That's what we're trying to figure out. But we're dealing with an actor that behaves differently from what we've ever been used to, and that's our big problem.
I have to ask you, Bob, given your roles, but primarily you were the premier of this province. Like, you know, there's a lot, obviously everyone watching is from Ontario. They have clients in the auto sector or adjacent to the auto sector. Like, how worried are you about the prospects for that sector, and what kind of fundamental shift economically do you think is underway?
Well, I think it's tough. But I don't think it's impossible. I think we all have to understand that we all know. I think what Barry has described. You know, this is what President Trump wants. I mean, there's a whole bunch of countries around the world who felt they had to have a steel industry. That you weren't a real country until you had a big steel industry. And the president is obviously one of those people who thinks that way. There are a lot of autocrats around the world who take the same view. I do think that ultimately, a lot of times in economics, wiser heads do prevail, because it doesn't make sense to me, and I actually don't think it's in, you know, there's a difference between what's in the interest of the administration and this particular drive and what's in the interest of the country, of the United States of America. Is it in the interest of the United States of America to impoverish Canada, to destroy Canadian manufacturing? No, it's not. It is not. So I would push back a bit with the Appleton scenario and say, yeah, it's tough, but we have a real case to make with our American economic partners to say this doesn't make any sense. His broad, geopolitical direction of saying we want you to be the 51st state, we're going to take you over, we're going to do all this, we're going to buy green land, we're going to do. This is all, in my opinion, it's all fantasy land. And it's coming apart at the seams, and increasingly Americans see how erratic this whole direction is. But that's when you say, what's the worst case scenario? That's the worst case scenario. Would Canada accede to that kind of a deal? No, it would be like Czechoslovakia in 1938. We're not going to sign an agreement that leads to our own demise as an effective economy. So I think we're in a fight. It's a very tough fight. We should not underestimate the consequences of getting it wrong or underestimating, what can happen. But we also need to, I think, look a little bit like, see where the cracks are in the American position. Yeah, the heads of the big three will turn up at a meeting because they have to. But that doesn't mean they agree with the president. It doesn't mean that they think it makes a whole lot of sense to destroy the entire Canadian auto industry and the entire Ontario auto industry. But it's also important to remember that as key as some manufacturing is, as key as these plants are, we need to understand that the economy itself is evolving and changing really quite dramatically. And we have to have a sense of what the future of our economy looks like, that in a sense goes beyond where we've been and says this is where we now need to go. And I think that's part of what the challenge of Canada is right now. How do we build the alternatives that allow us to get through what's going to be a very challenging time?
So let me just quickly follow up. And the reason I flagged those auto CEOs is because of the fact that they are making the argument against the tariffs. They're paying billions of dollars so far, but the way that in which when you watch them in the office, the amount of praise that they heap on the vernacular, the rhetoric, it's like it feels shocking against the logic of what is real and what has the real impact to their companies. But I take your point.
Fear breeds the most bizarre and least laudable behavior,
and
we're
last
seeing
year
that
has shown,
we're seeing that at work. And I think the one thing that, in disagreeing with Barry about the Prime Minister's speech, why I personally think the Prime Minister was right to give that speech, is because we can't be afraid to describe the world as we see it. At some point, we have to be the little boy who says, you know what, that emperor who's walking around, he doesn't have a stitch on. And that's what we've got right now. And I think the Prime Minister was way more diplomatic than I am. And yay, I don't have to be diplomatic.
You don't have to be anymore.
I don't have to be diplomatic anymore. I can just say what I think. I think, in fact, it's important for us to call out, what is the illogic of what is being proposed. And I think that's what makes this such a different kind of trade negotiation. It's not a trade negotiation in the way we've seen it before. And that's not the way the Canadian government is approaching it. The person who's the lead negotiator, Janice Charette, is probably the most experienced public servant in the whole system. She's not just working on trade issues. She's working with the whole of government. She's working with all of the provinces. She's working with Canadian civil society. She's got this large advisory group that's trying to give her insight into what's taking place. It's not going to be easy at all, but I don't think it's something where we just say we haven't got a hope. There's no chance. I don't take that view.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. What can you discern, Barry? Because Bob's right. Like, this feels very different. And I remember covering. You were a part of the initial NAFTA. I covered the CUSMA renegotiation, and there was a lot more public-facing commentary, right? Like Minister Freeland, we were there live every day, getting her comments. They were careful about what they said, but there was a lot of stakeholder engagement. We kind of knew the broad strokes of what their strategy was or what they hoped to achieve without giving away all the details. There's hardly any. I've done one interview with Minister LeBlanc in the last year. Like, it is very difficult to get anything out of them about what their objectives are. What can you discern their strategy is? What should it be? And what is our leverage?
Okay, so first of all, part of the problem is, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Minister LeBlanc. I think Dominic LeBlanc has done an incredibly good job in a very, very tough space. And he's patient, which you need to be in this space. But unfortunately, I'd look at it as a big holiday meal. There's a main table and there's a kiddies table, and we've basically been relegated to the kiddies table.
No, that's not true.
I think it is.
Well,
I'll give you a chance to respond in a moment, I promise.
And the reason why I say that is that there's a very small circle in Washington, mostly around the president and pandering to the president for sure, of what's going on, and we're not getting that space. And that's a problem, because this is a very unusual situation. And this is not a normal negotiation, not a structured negotiation. It's not a considered, philosophically based negotiation that we would get with the WTO when we did this, the TPP or things like that. This is totally different. And so, with all due respect, I don't think we're getting where we should be. We're not getting the face time that we should have. And I think that we're being relegated around because it's a leverage game. The game here is about leverage. And the perception from the Americans is that we can be bullied around. And that's what we see, and that causes uncertainty and fear. So here's the thing. What we know what they want are a couple of things. And we have leverage, I would say we have more leverage than we've had in 30 years of negotiations. And they are in areas that deal with energy and critical minerals and in defense and the bigger pictures that go with it. They are so energy dependent on Canada, in electricity, in oil. There's so much that can go on there, but we're not really using that leverage. Okay? The Prime Minister said he's not going to use the leverage, but we haven't been using the leverage. And I think we could use the leverage. So I would be prepared to take a tougher spot. Now, it's not my strategy. I feel like I'm the weatherman in a Iqaluit, okay? So I'm telling you, don't go out in a Speedo today because it's cold, okay? But I didn't make the weather. I'm kind of reporting the weather, all right? But at the end of the day, we have a tough area because we have to make, I think, some tough political choices. And I think we need to bring Canadians into that conversation. I think there's a tremendous upspring of support for the government and for the Prime Minister to be able to make those tough choices. And I actually think the Prime Minister should be having that focus and discussion with Canadians as early as possible and as much as possible, because I think that's where I would put it. I would have put the talk not in Davos to the world outside. I would put the talk to Canadians to talk about what we need to do together to be able to survive what's going on. So I agree that there's a world that's changed, the economy has changed, that what we need to focus on has changed. The red lines I look to are different for this negotiation than in the CUSMA. But I think the reason we're not having that much discussion is A, you don't win in Trump land by letting that out, and B, I don't think we know for sure.
I have lots of questions from the audience. Bob, I know you want to respond. You disagree about the kiddie table.
No, I don't really want to respond. Barry's said what he said. I don't agree with it. I think it's a cheap shot, and frankly, I don't think it's an accurate description of what's going on at all.
What is your view of what is going on then?
I think there's a lot of quiet discussions that are going on in a whole number of tables and a number of places about what the choices are and what the Americans are really looking at. I think it's an exceptionally difficult conversation all around, and I don't think it lends itself to describing Canada as being anything other than a country which is entering into a very difficult discussion. Mexicans are also entering into a difficult discussion. We're also talking with them. There's a ton of stuff that goes on that doesn't go on in front of the cameras. There's a tremendous stuff that goes on that people don't know about, that I don't know about. But what I do know is that it's going on. And I also know that, yes, there are other elements that, as I said, a lot of areas outside of the traditional trading relationship where we can talk about all of the areas that the Americans say they want to talk. But I come back to this point. It is so much easier sitting in these chairs and saying, no, he should have done that. I think he should have made that point. I would have been there. I would have done it differently. That's not the way things are going to happen. They're going to happen if we all understand as Canadians, we've got to work together on this. It's going to take an incredible amount of effort on the part of the whole country to deal with some of the questions we're going to have to deal with. And as I said before, it's possible that we won't, it's not going to be easy. We won't get a deal quickly. Others may get a deal more quickly than us. But I think that will be, in the end, I think it will be a three-part discussion. In the end, I think it will be a three-part arrangement. And I think it will consider a number of issues like defense, like the minerals, like energy, which clearly are issues of concern to the Americans. They're also of concern to Canadians. Do we want to give up our water? I mean, like, how much are we, if you ask the Americans, what do you want? They'll say, I want it all. I want your water, I want your sovereignty, I want this and I want that. And obviously as Canadians, we're going to say, well, you can't have that. And then it becomes a question of, well, what can you have? And to what extent, I think the other thing that I think is really difficult is to what extent are the Americans going to say, you know what, we want an exclusive. We want an exclusive on this, we want an exclusive on that. And for Canada, that's really not just theoretically, but in real terms, in the real world terms, it's very hard to do. And in fact, I would argue it's not possible to do because it runs against everything that sovereignty means. If we lose the capacity, having been at the UN, if we lose the capacity to say, well, we want to be able to have our own views. We don't agree with the Americans at the United Nations on a whole bunch of things now, and we should stop pretending that we do. We don't. We don't agree with them on Ukraine, which is critically important. We don't agree with them on, the future of the United Nations and how we rebuild global institutions. We don't agree with them on the WTO. We don't agree with them on World Health. We don't agree with them on immunization. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we parted company on. So is there a rupture? Yeah, there's a rupture with this administration. And is what this administration wants a complete revolutionary change that any future administration will have to follow? I don't think so. I think the Americans internally are going to have a very tough debate about what the future looks like. Because right now, who's isolated in the world? Canada or the United States? Mm-hmm. The answer is the United States is isolated. We're not isolated.
I do want to get to these questions, but you brought up Mexico. We'll try to get through as many as we can. James asks, Barry, what is the likelihood that we could end up with 2 bilateral agreements? I know Bob said that, will likely remain trilateral. What are your thoughts?
The U.S. Trade Representative has made very clear that he expects that there will be 2 agreements, that we may keep the CUSMA, we may not, but right now, if you asked me 6 months ago, I would have thought the CUSMA would be over. I now think that we'll keep the CUSMA as a base, but we're going to have, I'll call it bolt-on. The words they use in Washington are called agreements on regional trade, ARTs. They're the Trump deals. I think that we're going to see that, and I think we're going to see a totally bilateral deal out with Mexico, a totally bilateral deal out with Canada. And by the way, in many respects, the NAFTA, for example, was a putting together of a pile of bilateral deals anyways. We haven't architected a U.S.-Canada deal with the United States since 1987.
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting question, I think, that speaks to some of the conversation we had around diversification. What are the alternatives, Bob, to the U.S.? Europe is small and not thriving. India and China have proven to be bad partners from a human rights perspective. There aren't many other plausible partners. It's an interesting, there's lots of considerations everywhere, and that's actually part of what the Prime Minister has talked about, sort of this a little bit more transactional but somewhat values-based, like you make deals in areas where you can kind of thing. What do you think about that?
Well, we trade with countries all around the world. We have investment agreements. We have investments and trade with countries in every part of the world. And there's change and trade and economic development happening everywhere. I couldn't disagree more with the questioner about Europe. Europe is not small. Europe is a huge economy and has great potential, but not just Europe. Many parts of Asia are, their political systems are different from ours. And if you want to live in the world today, you're going to live in a world where people have different political systems. By the way, the American political system is very different from ours right now. Mm-hmm. Stuff goes on in the United States that in Canada you'd be charged by the RCMP for what's going on immediately. Mm-hmm. And that's a difference. That's a very important difference between us and the United States. Even the way in which people talk about, quote, transactional approaches. They're not just transactional. In many cases, they're self-enriching. And that poses a problem for us in terms of our own laws and our own ways of doing things. So we need to understand that. And I just think for the person who's asking the question, I just think we have to think bigger and more widely and more broadly. We already have free trade arrangements and agreements with more countries than any other single country in the world has. We're working at stitching up the Pacific Trade Agreement with the European agreements. We're really trying to broaden the scope and, frankly, the imagination of Canadians. And we're trying to strengthen our internal market, which we need to do. Trade barriers internally continue to be bad. Non-tariff barriers continue to be bad. Regulation duplication continue to be bad. And we've got the whole thrust on new infrastructure investment. So I think there's a lot of alternatives that are not, quote, alternatives to this trade arrangement because it is a significant part of our GDP. Our trade with the United States is a big part of our economy as a country. But it's not exclusively important. It is important, but it's not the only thing that's important.
So 20 seconds just on this. For the CPA community, trade agreements are nice, but it's businesses that make the deals. It's not the agreements that make the deals, it's businesses. And the CPA community are the trusted advisors that people go to first. So you can expand the market, but you need to think about it. And there are ways of being able to deal with that. So it's really about how do you mobilize what you've got right now to be able to think beyond the U.S., The U.S. was easy. It was nearby. We could kind of be lazy. That's how we got ourselves into trouble here. So I agree that we can go better and do more, even with what we've got right now. There's a large network of them, but I would say the CPAs are the trusted advisors at the first stop.
Let me actually follow up on that, because there's a question in like the vein of like the advice that they essentially provide their clients, and it builds off again what that big question was about what's the worst possible outcome. This questioner is asking, why can't we assume the worst possible outcome and plan how to survive? There are other countries that are in a worse position than Canada.
Well, yes and no. And the reason is because there are trade diversities, exactly the point that you raised earlier about the Japanese, why they put their investment in Canada, because they wanted the market access. So much of our investment was focused on that proximity and access. So that makes us different than many other countries. But so let's talk about planning for the worst. There are things that you can do with your clients. You can do an audit of where you're at. You can think about what your exposure is. You can think about what you can do to enhance your compliance with the agreement to get out of right now the 232 tariffs, for example, to the extent that you can comply. There are things that you can do to make it easier to cross the border and get those goods at a lower price. So those are things we can do right now. Also, I'd be thinking about digital, because that's where the economy is moving, intangibles, and I'd be looking at that. These are all straightforward things that trusted advisors. My view is that the CPAs are the frontline workers. They are the first responders. The clients, the business community come out, they go to their CPAs first, not last, and they can do 90% of the heavy lifting, if not more. That's where I would start.
Bob, a more politically minded question that will impact negotiations. Helen's asking, can we hope for a long-term agreement in view of a lame duck president and current U.S. political instability? Like, do you think that the domestic political climate in advance of midterms, during and through and after midterms, might have an impact on what we're able to achieve?
I think there is a scenario that, particularly in light of what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz, there's a way of saying to the president, you know what, we kind of need a win here. And it might be nice to have a win at a certain time frame. Maybe that persuades him, but also maybe not. I think the thing that what the Trump lesson to me is let's not exaggerate the extent to which a deal is a permanent deal, because there is a spirit of protectionism in the United States, without any question, that crosses the lines between parties. That means that, you know, where something itches, then you scratch it. And I mean, we saw this in lumber, for example. The American attacks on our lumber industry are entirely based on how successful we've been at penetrating their market, and the fact that the products we produce are products that the American consumers want, American businesses want, their builders want, their Home Depots want. They want what we produce. And so when Trump says we don't need your lumber, actually you do. You want it. If you didn't need it, why do you want it so badly? And then if we're too successful, in other words, if we trade really well, the political interests in the United States say, no, you can't do that, because a majority of the Senate is made up of senators who come from states that are very small in population and large in natural resources. And they have a hammer on what happens with respect to the trade of that one commodity. So we have to learn lessons from this to say, don't take certainty for granted, and don't think that we're dealing with a partner who's going to be bound by the same rules of law that we feel we're bound by. The Americans feel they're an exceptional country, and they feel that, hey, if this doesn't work for us, we can just change the law. We can change the rules. Or if you get a ruling from an American, from one of the tribunals on trade that says the Canadians are not actually subsidizing their lumber industry and they should not be punished in this way, they ignore the ruling of the tribunal. We have, Barry will know the number, but we have billions of dollars in a trust fund in the United States that the American companies have had to pay into, that one day we're going to get a part of it back. And that's going to be their deal. Nothing to do with the law, nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with what's appropriate, but it's what they can feel they can get away with. And unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with. So I hate to say this, I mean, yes, you go to your CPA and go to your lawyer and talk to people about what's possible, but the reality is it's not easy dealing with in some industries, it's really not easy dealing with the U.S. because of the politics of the situation. And the politics is very uncertain.
How many times, just building on that, somebody watching is asking, do you anticipate that CUSMA will have to be renegotiated in some way or form during this administration or after? It's difficult to make business decisions when we see the U.S. nullifying aspects of the agreement on a whim.
So look, that's a great question, because the goal was exactly to put that leverage in. So the way it works is, if all three parties agree that everything's fine, then it's done, and the agreement stays for 10 years. If there's a review and we say it's positive, it continues for 16 years. That was the sort of their pros, and they all started at year 6. But if one of the three says, no, I'd like a review, there's a review every year. That creates uncertainty, that creates leverage. That is exactly what the Americans wanted. That was the architecture of this agreement. It was an extractive agreement. We should not have agreed to that. There are other parts of the CUSMA that we should not have agreed on. We sort of see the CUSMA as a win. I'm telling you, as a trade lawyer, I don't see the CUSMA as a total win. I see there are areas that were problematic, and as the economy has evolved, particularly in digital and in IP and innovation, I see it as more and more of a problem. So that's a bit of the difference, but it's the extractive element. That was the unusual thing about this agreement, and that is keeping us up at night. And I can understand why the CPAs are worried, because our clients are worried. And don't have an easy way to fix it until we have a deal.
I mean, I think the problem we have, Vassy, is that, the administration that negotiated this deal has a different view of life than we do, and their approach is they actually want things to be uncertain.
Right.
They want, because they know that the Japanese,
we'll say
their
that,
message to the Japanese business, you know what, you want to sell cars in the United States, you come down here. And we've lived with that challenge all the way through. I mean, I know something from an Ontario business perspective, trying to get Japanese investment, trying to get Korean investment, trying to get European investment, the car industry. And all the time we're doing that, saying, come to Ontario, it's a good place to do business, good place for you to raise your kids, great training, good opportunities. Oh, and by the way, we'll give you some money to come. The Americans undercut that argument as much as they possibly could by always saying to those companies, if you really want to do business with us, you'll do business with us. And that's always been the tension in saying, we've had a free trade agreement, since the late 80s. The premise of the free trade agreement, we'd have access and we'd have a binding dispute resolution mechanism. Those were the two fundamentals of the agreement. You read the Reagan speeches, you read the speeches that were given at the time, that was the basic philosophy. Nothing could be more different than the administration's approach today. Nothing. But again, is that the view of all of American business, or is that the view of all of American society? I don't think so. But right now, that's the administration we have to deal with. The one we have is the one we have to deal with, and that's what makes it difficult.
Just like marriage therapy. Kidding. We've got 2 minutes left, and I have a final question that I'm going to put to each, like the same question, and each have a minute. What is the biggest misconception, Barry, Canadian business leaders currently have about the future of Canada-U.S. relations?
The biggest misconception is, and you can see it in the debate that we're having here, foundationally is this really about the peoples who love each other and work together and still do, or is it about the nature of the governments that may not see it the same way? And that is the biggest misconception. I love Canada. I think that we can do so much with the United States. And I see Americans, and they love Canada too. But at the end of the day, it's not a marriage, it's a transaction now. That's the big shift, and that's the biggest misconception. We have to get out of the sentiment and into the transaction. And that is not an easy thing, especially for someone who's focused on the rule of law and on building that for my entire life. I've had to change my view of it, and it's been tough.
Bob, the same question to you. What do you think the biggest misconception Canadian business leaders have right now about the future of Canada-U.S. relations?
Well, I think there's misconceptions both ways. I mean, I think the misconception is, everything, this is all very unpleasant, but we'll get through it. Everything's going to be fine. And eventually everybody will come to their senses. And I think that's a misconception. But I also think the other misconception is things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And there's no end to this. And it's throw up your hands and say there's nothing we can do. We do have to take full account of how difficult it is. And I certainly, I think we all understand, now if we didn't before, the difference between a transaction and a relationship. I think we all understand what that difference is and how important it is for us to deal with it. But I also think it's important for us to keep working with our American customers and with the people that we do business with and the people that we trade with, the people that we connect with, and keep on emphasizing the importance of, yes, the relationship, as well as it's a good deal too. I mean, we're not asking you to take a bad transaction. We're asking you to see the logic of the transactions that we're putting in front of you, and we think they're good for you, and they also think we're good for us. This notion in life that everything has to be, win-lose, I win, you lose, is not how most of us live, not how most of us think. It's not how we were brought up to live. So I don't think we should give up on that notion that that's still going to be the objective that we want to try and reach.
We'll leave it on that note. Not a zero-sum game. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bob. Thanks,
Thank
Barry.
you.
Real pleasure. Thanks very much, everybody watching.
Thank you, Vassy, Barry, and the Honourable Bob Rae. We knew that would be a thought-provoking conversation, but a lot of debate and dialogue there. This is a topic that I think we're going to be having for this kind of a conversation for a while now. But a couple comments I just do want to highlight, and it was the Honourable Bob Rae who said, right, this is a difficult trade negotiation than ever before that we're going into, but we do have leverage. Critical minerals, defense, water, energy. I know that was a question on everybody's mind, and I think we've heard from our panelists that there's elements of leverage that we do have, but how are we going to use them? It's tough. It's doable. Businesses on both sides want this deal to happen and want an agreement in place. And I'll close with Barry Appleton's words, which were, CPAs are the trusted advisors that whatever this agreement looks like, you're the ones who are going to have to make this deal work. So to that end, we will continue to bring you our Insight Speaker Series. And on behalf of all of us at CPA Ontario, thank you for joining us for this conversation, and have a great afternoon.